Hello everyone, and welcome to Coopsys TechTalks. This is our new way of letting you know about things that are happening in the tech industry and how we can help you. So today I have Dan from our security team joining me again. And what we'd like to talk about today is incident response and system architecture. So Dan, let's set the table a little bit, taking a step back and putting this into some context. When we think about security, it's almost like there's an X and a Y axis, right, of security, or maybe a better way to think about it is a left hand and a right hand. A lot of what we do and what your team does in security is how do we prevent bad things from happening?
Right.
So a lot of thinking about and taking preventative measures. The other piece is what do we do when a bad thing happens? So we're never going to be 100% able to prevent all bad things from happening. Sort of goes back to that adage that we have to be right 100% of the time. They only have to get it right once.
Right.
So when we think about incident response, it's really that other side. It's what happens when a bad thing happens. And we'll explore that a little bit. But before we get there, let's think about system architecture. And so going back to that, before the bad thing happened, there are two things, right? Now, one is what do we do, as I've mentioned, what do we do to put in place processes that will look to protect so that bad things don't happen. Another dimension before the bad thing is the planning for an incident response. So in a moment, we're going to talk about incident response, right? What do you do when an incident happens? But the dynamic of in the effectiveness of that response will be largely impacted by the planning we do to prepare for it. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. So talk a little bit about system architecture and planning for an incident.
So where you do mention system architecture, that is important, but one other important feature of incident response is going to be having an incident response plan, having effective policies in order to make sure that everyone knows their job, everyone knows what is expected of them. There's no running around trying to figure out who's the commander of this incident response. You have your incident response commander, you have your incident response manager who's going to manage all of the individuals that are doing all of the sub goals. You have everything planned out beforehand. Mm-hmm. So that is the paramount. If you do not have an incident response plan, you got to work on that.
Right.
That's something that you want to make sure that if something does happen, you have those proper lines of communication. Somebody who's in charge of reaching out to the legal team in order to get your cyber liability insurance involved. Somebody who's involved in whatever needs to happen as far as the management team, who needs within the management team to be involved. What departments need to be involved? Is this an HR related incident? Is this something related to something that happened on a third party system that you're working with? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of variables you have to consider there. So you need to make sure that you've kind of addressed from that perspective. When it comes to the system architecture, you're looking at things like even something so small as, I say small, it's not a small undertaking at all, but having something where you have air gaps in certain systems. If you have a system that doesn't need to communicate with your production network, have it VLAN'd off, have it cordoned off. Make sure that you are taking the steps that you need in order to make sure that if there is something that gets affected, it has as minimal a spread or effective area as possible. Mm-hmm. Things of that sort, thinking in that perspective, can help save you a lot of time and a lot of money.
So I'm hearing two things I'd like to underline in what you just said. One is the design of the architecture matters, right? So when we're thinking about how we structure the information system, anticipating incidents is is an important dimension to planning that architecture.
Yes.
Okay. And then the other thing I'd like to underline there is that, again, anticipating an incident is important in that plan. The least effective moment to create an incident response plan is when an incident has happened. Like,
Yes.
the house is on fire, metaphorically, and so that's when you're going to be at your worst in effective controls and plans and efficiency. I know you mentioned several departments we have to consider, like who needs to be. Customers may need to be notified, right? So that might become a marketing dimension. So, as you said, there are many, many different things, and am I right in saying that part of that incident response, and we'll walk through this, something happens and it gets defined as an incident. So there's some trigger or some threshold that says, okay, this is an incident. And the type of incident should inform which part of the incident response tree happens, right? So, in other words, all incidents are not the same.
Correct. You do have security incidents, you have internal incidents that may have absolutely nothing to do with system security. So incident, non-incident, or a critical incident, those are all going to be different definitions for how certain incidents need to be handled. And like, for example, an incident could just as much be a virus was detected or malware was detected on an endpoint, as much as it could be a system is down. A business critical system being down is considered an incident.
Right.
It could actually be considered a critical incident. So those are things to consider. So incident response isn't necessarily just security related, but coming from that security perspective, if you do have a security incident that you need to address, at that point, in many ways it is similar because you do have to bring a lot of the same parties into it. But there are differentiating factors that need to be considered. So for example, is this something that is simply an incident of like a user clicked on an email? Somebody clicked on a link in an email, it brought them to a page where they're supposed to log in. We would consider that an incident because they have interacted with something. However, it has not impeded the business. They did not enter their credentials. It is not a critical incident where there is a compromise on credentials. So at that point, you would address it, reset the password just out of an abundance of caution, do whatever else you need to do. But that is something that you don't necessarily need to have a full incident response plan where you need to bring in the manager, you need to bring in the primary contact, you need to bring in every single individual. That is something that can be addressed with that individual user and like their manager or something like that. So that's just an example of how you can have different parties that get involved with these different incidents.
So the incident response plan, the incident response team would define that, right? Would set those parameters and determine the gates, right? So if this happens, we need to go here.
And keep in mind, that would all be determined before the incident occurs.
Exactly, right.
So
That's important, right? So that we've anticipated as much as we can the dimensions of what an incident and or a security incident would be, so that we efficiently and effectively manage that response. Is that fair?
yeah, so you want to make sure you have those lines of communication open, so if there is something that comes up that is not addressed in your current incident response plan, you can know who you reach out to. So you have a general understanding of like, okay, this is the individual who is like the primary. If there is an incident, we reach out to them. They determine, delegate, and do whatever is needed based off of the incident response plan, or establish that new incident response plan as needed based off of an existing general format that you have for, we've never experienced this, but we know this individual is going to need to be involved, this individual, and based on what we have here, we can pull people in as we need. But you still have to have the skeleton of that process built so that you can address those concerns before they even happen.
Right. So planning is one thing, right? So it can be a very well documented plan that sits in a binder, but people need to know it, right? They need to be familiar with it. So training, once you've created an incident response plan, we've talked about this a little bit before. This is where desktop exercises come into play and say, hypothetically, this happens, what do we do? And that's where you execute on that incident response in a controlled environment.
Yep. So utilizing tabletop exercises, going through and seeing how your incident response plan would hold up. It's very helpful to have someone that has kind of an adversarial mindset to set up that tabletop exercise just so they can try to think of, okay, even if I don't know what the incident response plan is, this is how I believe that a threat actor would do this.
Right.
So that's why sometimes you got to take that, like, bad guy twirling to the, mustache kind of mentality and be like,
Yeah.
all right, this is how we're going to make sure that we take this system down.
Yeah.
Build that process, and then once that's done, create that tabletop exercise and try to inflict as much damage as you can in that controlled environment,
Right.
to see how your incident response plan holds up. Because you need to assume that the threat actor is going to do everything in their power to maintain a foothold, to maintain control of the situation, to be able to expose as much as possible, to be able to compromise as much as possible. And one point that I did want to make about incident response plans, making sure that you have them created beforehand, we're all human in the end. We have that guttural reaction when there's a threat or there's an incident or there's something that happens, and the fear can kick in. Having an incident response plan can help to control for that variable. Not all the way, it's still going to be scary. You see that big red screen show up that says you got some sort of ransomware on your PC. Suddenly you have to pay a ransom to some organization you've never even heard of, to a Bitcoin wallet you don't even recognize, and you're saying, well, I don't know what to do here. It's going to be scary.
Right.
But being able to keep a level head and be like, wait, we have a plan for this.
Yeah.
Let's break out the binder. Let's review with the individual who we need to communicate with. Let's make sure that we follow the proper lines of communication. That's going to help a lot of people feel a lot better, because instead of sitting there with their hands open like, what do I do? They have a direct goal, they have a direction that they need to go in, and then once you follow through with that, that's going to make it so much easier for you to be able to proceed in an orderly fashion, as opposed to complete disarray, trying to understand what that next step should be.
So it's a little bit like keep calm and execute the plan.
Yes.
Right. Interesting. Okay. Well, let's step back again a little bit. So talk a little bit about what goes into creating an incident response plan.
So tabletops are a good place. Having that can kind of show you your weak points. Additionally, you need to make sure that you have someone that holds the sole responsibility of the incident. So you need to figure out who within your organization is going to be that individual, like your incident response guru, the person who has the most knowledgeable position to be able to come up with who needs to be involved in which situation. So this can be, they know that you need to bring in a compliance officer. So if you are a HIPAA managed organization, you know that you have your HIPAA compliance officer, because every HIPAA managed company or HIPAA compliant company should have a HIPAA compliance officer. You know that that person needs to be pulled in if there's a potential incident with PHI.
Right.
So having that understanding could be helpful, but that's not going to be the best person to be the manager of the incident response, because they're not going to know what to do with, hey, what is Blue Keep? I don't understand what that means.
Right.
So you want to make sure that it's someone that's a little bit more technical, that has an understanding. Typically, it's going to be a manager within a technical field within your organization. Find the person that fits the role best, someone who is comfortable with that. Design that initial setup, and then figure out who underneath needs to fit into certain roles. There are many, many resources online for incident response plans and how to set up individuals within your organization. So search for any of them that seem like they fit your organization, and then kind of design that, because that framework of individuals is the initial step to any incident response plan, making sure that you have that hierarchy and that proper line of communication, because that's the first thing. Like, before you have an incident response for, if we get ransomware, we do A through Z. Before you even have that, if you know who the person is that you need to go to, or if you have that again, direct line communication, this is the person that we need to speak to, that's going to provide you with context you can use to move forward in the right direction instead of, again, being scatterbrained, looking everywhere else.
Right, because I think what I hear you saying is these incidents are not often, maybe never, completely linear, right?
Right.
They're dynamic environments, so the plan is critically important, but it's not push a button and automate, right? You've got to have context and be aware of what's happening. So you find the right people, get that structured in place. Is it helpful to have, to be fair, someone like us speak with the client in the context of anticipating what are the kinds of things that can happen?
Yeah, I mean, in any case, you're going to be talking to somebody who is living. If you have a managed service provider, you're going to be talking to somebody that is living in that world.
Yeah.
Especially if they're an MSSP or if they have some sort of security team as we do, or some security focused section within their company.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be able to provide a lot more context than just looking up on some sort of browser, just, hey, what can I find about this particular threat actor group or whatever else. They're living in it. They're exposed to it daily, potentially. They're looking into all this, researching it, getting the news about it, focusing on what's a real threat, what's not a real threat, what's something that's coming up like down the pipe that's affected certain people already that we need to prepare for, what CVE was just released. Having that expertise and that perspective is going to be incredibly helpful. So bringing in your MSP into the development of your incident response plan is incredibly valuable.
Right.
That is assuming that it's not that you're fully managed and your MSP already has that incident response plan in place for you. If it's something that you design internally, which obviously you do have to have as a company, you want to make sure that you know that proper line of communication. So with that, even if you are fully managed, communicate with your MSP. Make sure that you have those lines of communication internally for yourself, how you would handle the incident response.
Right.
It's just the tech part of it that's been taken away.
Right.
But as far as what you need to do, that is still going to be on you. So
Right.
communicating with your customers, communicating with individuals that may be affected outside of your customers, like other companies, third-party vendors, things of that sort. You want to make sure that you're hitting all of those points.
You said possibly HR.
Exactly.
Those are all things. Right. That makes sense. What are what are some metrics that can be used to evaluate the effectiveness of an incident response plan?
So using something such as like a tabletop again, you can try to figure out how easy the process was for you. How long did you spend on that event? How long did you spend trying to figure out what the incident was?
Mm-hmm.
How long did it take you to be able to figure out who to communicate with next? Mm-hmm. So those are pretty decent metrics. The initial metric you can use is how difficult was it for you? How difficult was it for you to create that incident response? So if you're finding that you're constantly questioning every single aspect of it, you don't know what the next step is, kudos to you for taking that step in the first place. But if it's that difficult for you, that's actually a sign of a bigger issue. That shows that you don't necessarily have a security-centered mindset. You don't have a business continuity mindset. You haven't put any thought towards this, which a lot of folks don't. You have a business to run. You have all these things that you need to do on a day-to-day basis that are just keeping you completely grounded. It's difficult to look up into effectively the ether of what happens if we have a compromise. And I get that. But unfortunately, in today's day and age, you can't really ignore that. There's a lot of threat actors out there that are looking to do as much damage as possible to even as small a target as possible. So you need to keep that security mindset and you need to focus on managing, again, how long did it take you to create that security or that incident response plan? If it took you 3 weeks and multiple meetings of an hour each, and you still don't even have the first step of let's create a framework of who needs to be communicated with in certain parts of an incident, that shows that you really need to work on that posture and you need to figure out that, first of all, that group. And once you figure out that group, really focus on is this something we can handle? Is this something that we need to outsource to an MSP? Is this something that we need to look to figure out that next step from a professional instead of banging our head against the desk trying to figure out what that next step is going to be?
Right. So what I'm hearing you say is the metrics, one metric is just the time
Yes.
invested, and then some sort of, whenever we do a tabletop exercise, some method of scoring that to say, how did we do, right? There's a little bit of gamification of that tabletop.
All right. Have fun with your tabletops. Absolutely.
Yeah? Okay. What else would be important to know or think about in terms of incident response?
Really just, it is about the people. The biggest gap in any sort of security stance is going to be your people. Make sure you have the right people in the right seats. Make sure you understand the system that you have built. And when it comes up and you need to follow it, you need to follow it. If there is somebody who is an expert in a certain area and an incident comes up, promote them within that chain that you have already built to a position where they're an SME, a subject matter expert, and have them work on trying to present that resolution.
Yeah.
The preparedness is also huge. You want to make sure that you are covering all of your bases before you get to the point that an incident is going to occur. And then that way, when it does, you've really made sure that you've covered that. And I think that's another metric in a way, your preparedness for it. How many incident response plans or how many pieces of an incident response plan do you have?
So I think that one recurring theme that I want to just wrap up with, what I'm hearing you say is, like almost everything in security related items, it's not so much an event as it is a process. Like it's an ongoing dynamic thing. You never stop planning for incident response. And part of the reason for that is the threat landscape continually changes. And so you need to have a rigorous and enthusiastic commitment to being aware of that landscape so that your incident response plan adapts to the things that are happening.
Correct. The security landscape isn't a mountain that you need to climb. It is an ocean that is constantly making waves.
Great.
It's constantly moving. You have to adjust for, you'll get a rogue wave coming at you. You need to make sure you point your bow in the right direction. So the issue that you run into with a lot of these plans that are created is you create that initial plan, you look at it as, okay, we're done, we did this, and then you're just hands off. And then some new threat opens up in the landscape, you're completely unprepared for it, and you're just caught there not knowing what that next step is because none of the processes that you've built will address that concern. So you always want to make sure that you are learning, moving, understanding how the threat landscape is changing. If you don't, involve somebody who does, involve somebody who has that expertise. And once you've got that firm grasp on it, know what your part is within that process. It's not something that you want to be sitting there putting out the fire after it's happened. Excuse me. You want to make sure that you have a plan to prevent the fire, and when the fire starts, get it when it's just that one piece of paper on fire, not when it's an entire room.
Right. So part of what that reminds me of is kinds of things we've been reading about and hearing about of AI-generated threats. That's relatively recent in the threat landscape, and they're getting better at it.
Yes. Yeah. Getting to the point where you can completely emulate what sounds like a normal human individual because you're able to set inflection points within the artificial intelligence. And that artificial voice sounds exactly like the person you're expecting on the other side of the phone, which another issue you have is, I could go down the rabbit hole on this, I'm sorry, but it becomes very difficult to tell what's real and what's fake.
Right.
And you run into an issue where artificial intelligence is so new, we don't have the processes and policies and things of that sort in place at a majority of companies.
Right.
So you have to have a very forward-thinking perspective to think, okay, this is how we can prepare for artificial intelligence, how it can be used. Let's figure out some training that we can do, some tabletop we can do, something we can do internally to address that concern and make sure that we're touching on all those details.
So it sounds like that would be a robust topic for a future discussion.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you spending some time with us.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.